Now, Aaron, where are you? Where is Aaron right now? No Aaron, huh? Well, you better be sick, dead, or mute, Aaron.
Here? Oh, man.
Why didn't you answer me the first time I said it?
Good morning from the Bat Cave. It is Tuesday, August 25th, 2026. And this video is just going to be a channel update to kind of talk you through what's been going on, what's new, and what's planned for the future with this channel. If you guys are following it, there's going to be, well, first of all, we're going to, at the top of the list, we're going to have a book release. So I finished Serpent by the Way Sunday, and it is live on Amazon if any of you guys want to get that. Same price as the other books. It's a longer book. It's a more substantive read. I think it's better writing, and it's a smaller font. I had to use a 10-point font to keep it under 400 pages, so I don't think that's going to be too small for you. Most of the stuff that I was reading through the course of this has that smaller font in it, but if you have my Apostles teaching book, that'll be no problem for you. That's kind of got a smaller font because I use a it's called a Perpetua font instead of a New Times Roman font, but this is about the same size as that. It's a New Times Roman font in a 10-point font. So I use that, and then I use the Perpetua 11-point font whenever I'm doing a quote of a scripture, whether it's the Bible I'm quoting or some other text that I'm quoting, if I'm putting it in line there, or if I'm putting a block citation in there. And so this is the book, and the book is, if you guys have not been following the Serpent by the Way series, it's a summary of my research on the ancient Near East, going all the way up to really, really the book of Revelation. But I'm going to kind of walk you guys through the table of contents of that book and kind of tell you what it's about. And hopefully you'll be interested in it. From my research perspective and my writing perspective, I think it's my best writing so far. But I'm going to kind of walk you through what my purpose was behind it, and then what it ended up being, because you always, when you research, you don't necessarily end up with what you thought you were going to end up with in the beginning. And then you open the doors for a bunch more things that you thought you knew about, and turned out you learned things you didn't know. So Serpent by the Way it's basically a history of the Antichrist, basically in Satan's working alongside the biblical revelation to deviate and distort and twist the biblical revelation into what we now know as paganism. And so what this does is it covers that story from the beginning. So it kind of uses the themes of basically the two women carrying the vessel in Zechariah, which says this is wickedness and it's eventually going to return to Shinar. And what it is talking about is basically the history of false religion from what was held by the Canaanites and the Sethites before the flood, all the way to what is going to crystallize before Christ returns, which I believe is going to be some kind of Gnostic, UFO-based, transhumanist-based false religion. It's essentially going to turn the world into one big suicide cult. So that's kind of following what Christ says in the Gospels, where he said if those days had not been cut short, no flesh would be saved. I think that's very literal. I think the goal is to destroy all human flesh and get everybody to think they're merging with AI or uploading their consciousness onto the machine, kind of like the Antichrist does with the image of the beast. And the goal of Satan is to turn the world into one big, huge suicide cult where everybody's dead. And so there's nobody left for Christ and the church to rule over. That seems to be their goal. And obviously Christ has a word to fulfill for the church, that they would rule and reign with him. So obviously if it's only Christians there, there's nobody to rule and reign over. So the point is that's what Christ is going to show up to stop, and then we're going to have the millennium to fulfill that promise of ruling and reigning, and also a bunch of prophecies about the both the righteous and unrighteous nations going up to worship and learn from the Messiah in his reign from Jerusalem. And so this is kind of leading you through that pathway of how Satan is developing the false doctrine alongside the true biblical revelation throughout history to kind of consolidate towards that goal. Okay, so it's kind of an anti-Bible, if you will. It's what Satan is doing to twist and distort what's in the Scripture. But what this work is doing is it's kind of showing you guys how he's waiting for God to give the revelation and then twisting it, and then it's popping up in all these false religions all over the world together. So it starts out just with the introduction. I start out with a summary of why I disbelieve the LXX chronology. I think, and I'm going to be doing a lot more research and writing on this, but I think the LXX is largely a whitewashed history of where it came from, what its motives were, and when it was finished. This is a Bible that a lot of people want to tell you was written by 70 Jewish scholars under Ptolemy II. Based on all the research I've found, that is completely untrue. It is what it really is a book that was finished up probably under Origen's disciples in the 4th century CE, and it was based on a syncretic tradition that goes all the way back to the 2nd century BCE under Aristobulus in the time of the Maccabees. And during that time, this mysterious letter of Aristeas about the 72 scholars that magically wrote a perfect Bible, it's kind of like the King James only controversy of its day, which ironically, the King James only controversy started about 150 years ago, and this started about 150 years before before Christ came. So I don't think that's ironic at all. I think Greek was the English of that day, and so you have something almost exactly like King James onlyism, and this would be like LXX onlyism. This is the one true Bible, and it finishes in the 2nd century. The last book to be added to this canon is actually 2nd Esdras, which 2nd Esdras is written in the 2nd century CE. It's a false book that claims that Ezra was a prophet, and in the prophecies he gets, he cites that there are 24 books that are going to be given to the common people, which is how the Jews by that day accounted the Old Testament canon. In Josephus's day, it was 22 books, but they had subdivided a couple of books out. I believe it was Lamentations that they subdivided out, and maybe Ruth, to 24 books. And then it says that there's going to be 70 books that are only for the wise. Okay? Well, that prophecy seems to be based on the Masoretic canon versus the LXX canon, and that seems to be a Gnostic false prophecy that says this is the Bible for the Muggles and this is the Bible for the initiated. Okay, so just that alone is so suspect that every scholar should be like, okay, we need to scrutinize the crap out of this book, and yet they're not. Okay. And these are things that I find in, again, having gone to seminary, having been reading and researching academic stuff for years, there is this grand conspiracy of silence about how bad Origen was in his doctrine and how influential he was in the build-up to the Council of Nicaea and in the formation of the quote-unquote oldest and best manuscripts that turned into the critical textual tradition. Okay, and so just for reference, I used to when Wes Huff was first starting to get big, and he was posting more stuff on Facebook and things like that before he blew up on YouTube, I would challenge some of the things he was saying about textual criticism and saying, hey, how come you guys never talk about how Origen and Origen School were probably responsible for these so-called oldest and best manuscripts, and how we know that they were essentially teaching reincarnation and syncretizing Platonic and Stoic philosophy and Pythagoreanism. Why aren't you guys more suspicious of how they handled the Bible? Because we certainly know that one or the other or both camps of Jews corrupted the Old Testament. We know because we have two very different Bibles. So either one or both of them has to be corrupt. Well, the tradition of corrupting and changing the scriptures and adding pseudoepigrapha to the canon seems to largely circulate around Alexandria, Egypt. And that tradition doesn't seem to stop at any time. Okay, so it seems to just bleed forward from the Jews to the Christians, and it's also where a lot of the Gnosticism pops up. So, to me, like when academics are reasonable and thorough, then I respect them. When they seem to not want to go near certain topics, then I don't respect them. And this is something that, your academics are going to want to take people like me and be like, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. Well, then, if I'm a conspiracy theorist, answer my freaking question. And they never do. And so, like, Wes Huff would go back and forth. This is when he was still doing his PhD thesis. And I would be challenging some of the propositions that are held on textual criticism. And I would say, I'm not a King James onlyist, but why aren't you more critical of this in terms of the textual critical camp? And he would, cite his academic expertise and say, well, I'm working on collating texts and I'm working on handling physical manuscripts for my PhD, so therefore I know. And that's not anything. That's like me saying, well, I've read a bunch of books, so therefore you don't get an answer for that question. See, and this was Wes Huff. This is what he's doing. And I'm bringing up the origin stuff and nothing. I went to seminary and, went to Phoenix Seminary, and they have this so-called Text and Canon Institute where these guys, who are promoted as top scholars in Greek and Hebrew, right? And even like one of the Greek professor there was promoted by Mike Winger, for instance, when he was tearing up the Passion Translation. And, I'm asking these guys, why are you saying Origen was a great Hebrew or a great genius of a scholar, and whitewashing the fact that he was a total freaking Gnostic heretic? And nobody talks about this. And this is what we find in academia from the time of ancient Egypt all the way into the present, is that these people who are very much into Gnosticism and very much into looking at Gnostic texts as kind of like a credible supplement to the Bible in terms of the academic textual critical work, the fact that they're either just unbelievers or they kind of like these Gnostic ideas is overlooked, because these guys they're just academics. They're not cult leaders. They're just academics. They're just looking at it academically, and they're looking at it critically. And the reality is most of these academics are just too stupid to realize that these people are using the academic framing, just like they're using the scientific framing, to import ideas. And just for an example of what's going on right now in academia, this is a recent thing. You have academics trying to prove critically that Marcion's Gnostic gospel was the original Luke, and that the Luke that we have was the embellished, later created tradition. I mean, this is what we get out of academia. From academia, we get that 2 Peter didn't write Peter. We get that, maybe John some other John the Elder wrote 2nd and 3rd John, even though they line right up with 1st John and the Gospel of John about what they're talking about, right? Like, it's very clearly these were all written around the same issues in Ephesus, and yet we're going to just try to, cast doubt on who wrote them. We're going to cast doubt on whether or not the Revelation was written in before 70 AD about Nero, or if it was written in 150 AD. Or if it was written around 96 CE, okay? This is something that academics do. It's like they're jamming it's like they're jamming a pipe in the spokes of the bike of the church constantly, just throwing a monkey wrench in what the church is doing, which is, yes, we believe the Bible is true. there are people who go in varying degrees to say that every detail in it is perfectly true. Remember, these are books that were sometimes written using histories that weren't necessarily inspired. But the prophetic stuff and the claims of what God did and the claims of who God said and what he said to who, those are absolutely true. But sometimes some of the historical details they're wrapped around aren't necessarily perfect because those were the historical context of what these guys were writing. They weren't automatic writing like the Holy Spirit possessed them and took over their hand like a poltergeist. Okay? And so the things they're writing, it's kind of like me writing. Well, the Holy Spirit could move in me and I could say something that's very anointed, but it doesn't mean everything I say around what I say is super anointed and the Holy Spirit speaking. Okay? Well, that was how people understood inspiration to be back in the day, back in the Jewish day. They understood that there were certain details in the writings that clearly came from God, not from man, and that's what made the writings inspired. And the fact that these prophets were valid, they weren't known for false prophecy, they weren't known for making mistakes. It wasn't the fact that, for instance, if you find a discrepancy in a number or something between an archaeological record and the Book of Chronicles, or between the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles, that doesn't do anything to damage inspiration, because nobody's in the book is saying God said this thing. They're just taking a royal chronicle of what happened historically, and then they're putting the prophecies into it to say, here's what God was doing within this history. And so we look at that and go, okay, we understand that's how inspiration works. And we find conversations in the Talmud about the Jews and stuff like that, and those are the kinds of arguments they were having. Okay? This is how people understood inspiration. And it's the same thing with the New Testament. Well, somewhere along the line, you had textual critics which really started in the church with Origen. This kind of work was going on in Alexandria, Egypt, because they were collecting all these books from all over the world, and the books didn't all say the exact same thing. And so out of that tradition of copying books in Alexandria, you have people comparing texts and coming to theories about what the original said based on variations in texts they have afterwards, okay? Well, Origen seems to be the person who starts doing this with the Bible. But before Origen, we have whoever wrote the LXX clearly smoothing out distinctions in the text. We definitely know they were doing this. For instance, in the book of Samuel, we know from the book of Chronicles, there's 3 different sources in just 1 Samuel. One is the book of Samuel, one is the book of Gad the seer, and one is the book of Nathan the prophet. So there were originally 3 books that became 1 Samuel. And because they're 3 different books from 3 different authors, it shouldn't be shocking that a certain point of detail is there might be a discrepancy there, and there is a discrepancy there. So for instance, Samuel's book has David knowing Saul and being his harpist before he fights Goliath, but the book that seems to be Gad the seer's book has David meeting Saul for the first time when he goes and fights Goliath. Okay, so we look at those 2 things and you go, if you know your Bible well, you're going, okay, well, that's because those are 2 different books. And maybe Gad the seer just didn't know that David was Saul's harpist before. Samuel would have known, because Samuel anointed David, and he knows the inner workings of Saul's court until Saul tries to kill him, basically. So, but Gad the seer didn't seem to know that. Gad the seer seems to know what's going on with David from the time of David's running away from Saul, because he was the prophet that was with David when he was running away. But he doesn't seem to know those earlier years, because remember, David's an adult. He's probably in his 30s by the time he's on the run from Saul, but it would have been like 15 years earlier, and Samuel dies during that time. So the source that would have said, hey, David knew Saul, from a teenager because he was his harpist, we don't know that Gad the seer and Samuel ever knew each other. And so they're not coordinating their details in the book. And Gad the seer is prophesying stuff for David, and there's stuff in that book, in that part of Samuel, that definitely came from God. And then there's other stuff that may have come from hearsay. So he introduces, and Gad the seer introduces David when everybody figured out who David was, which was when he got famous and killed Goliath. But Samuel, who's known Saul since Saul was first anointed, and anointed David, knows that David has some earlier history with Saul. The problem is Gad the seer is a prophet on the run with David, and Samuel lives up near the tabernacle, and he lives among these prophets. So you've got one in Judah and one up in northern Israel. They don't live near each other. And whoever took Samuel's book, because it mentions Samuel's death, and then finishes it off, you have two overlapping chronologies that don't start and end with each other because they're not written in concert with each other. And so when whoever puts kings together, which seems to be a prophetic tradition that includes Isaiah and Jeremiah, when they put them together, there's a little bit of overlap there. And because in that overlap, there's details that disagree, you have this clunky little section in Samuel where it talks about David knowing Saul, and then Saul saying, "Who is this guy?" when David shows up to kill Goliath. Okay? And so this little overlap section here, for those of us who know our Bible carefully, we know that's where Gad the seer's book starts, and that's where Samuel's ends. But whoever put them together just coordinated them and copied details out of them. They didn't change them. They didn't change the books to smooth it out to be a more consistent story, because these are prophets. They're not taking their words and just changing them. Even if there's a mistake there might be a mistake, but it's a historical mistake made by a human. Not every word in a book written by a prophet is written by God. It's the stuff about God that comes from God that is inspired. So there's details like that in Masoretic that's very clear. It's because it's original. That's how we know it's original, because the mistake's there. Okay? And we have similar things in the books of Chronicles and the books of Kings. There are mistakes in them, but the mistakes show us that it's original. Because again, we have scribes copying records, different records from different families about their genealogical history, and different records from different books of prophets, and different books of official national records, royal chronicles, to compose these books. And if those have mistakes or discrepancies in them, well, those discrepancies are going to be in it, and that's how we know it's original. See, nobody's making the claim when they're writing this stuff that God is writing this. Ezra is called Ezra the scribe. He's a scribe. He's a scholar who's writing stuff down, okay? And so scribes are known for copying things, not writing things. Ezra was not a prophet. There's nothing in anything Ezra does that suggests the hand of God is moving him in what he's doing, or Nehemiah. Now, we know from the books that God is moving on them. So in other words, God is providentially inspiring them in the work that they're doing. Ezra is restoring the temple, worship and sacrifices. Nehemiah is building the wall, which is fulfilling a prophecy. And it talks about God moving on their hearts. But what it doesn't talk about is God moving on them in their writing Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. It doesn't. These are just guys who were probably providentially moved to write these books and these history because it documents important things, but they're not prophets and they're not prophecies. And so when we find these little mistakes in them, that doesn't wreck our understanding of divine inspiration, because there's nothing in it that's claiming to be inspired by God. Okay? Now, that being said, the LXX is going to change it. They're going to change the Bible to make it sound more perfect. They're going to change words. They're going to change statements. They're going to change information to make it sound more like King James only. Every word is perfect. Nothing can be altered. God's hand wrote it. Okay? That's what happens with the LXX when it's written. We know because of those details that are different. And what your scholars are going to do is say, hey, look, this number doesn't make sense in the Masoretic, but it makes sense in the Septuagint. That's how we know it's original. Why? Because they're looking at it through a lens of divine inspiration, which is the same lens that the King James onlyists look at it to say the King James is the best and most inspired Bible. We don't do that. The King James is written by scholars and scribes, not prophets. And people are going to, these kind of myths are going to pop up in the church history. These myths that, oh, the divinely inspired God made the Council of Nicaea what it is. And how did we get the canon? They're going to literally make this stuff up. Oh, they put all the books that they believed were canon on a table, and all the ones that weren't supposed to be canon fell off the table, but the ones that were supposed to be canon stayed on the table. These are legends. These are myths. This didn't happen. Okay? It's the same thing with the letter of Aristeas and the 72 scholars. It's the same thing with, your King James only is talking about how God made this one last Bible for the end times. Well, remember, these guys were literally thinking it was the end times in the 1600s and in the 1800s when they're first starting to pop up this theory among the Seventh-day Adventists, who are literally, this is who starts the King James only stuff, or who makes it popular at least. And these Seventh-day Adventists are telling you it's the end times. They're telling you they're in the last generation, because supposedly in like the 1830s, Jesus came and went to the Holy of Holies, and he's doing a secret mystical division between the righteous and the wicked, and then there's going to be the Sunday laws, mark of the beast controversy, and then that's the end times in that generation. That's what the Seventh-day Adventists were teaching. And within that context, they were saying, and God wrote the King James Bible, which was really stupid because the King James was written in the 1600s and changed and altered and modified until the 1800s. But they weren't telling you that. And then they were saying, in their day, the King James that was around in their day was God's one last final Bible for the last days. And lo and behold, almost 200 years later, we're still in the last days, and it's still the one last only great Bible God wrote for the last days, okay? That's really stupid. But the same kind of stuff was going on when they wrote the LXX. We have substantial circumstantial evidence that the LXX was changed to align with the Manethos Aegyptica, which makes sense because they're writing this stuff under the Maccabees, as the Maccabees are basically claiming the seat of the Messiah and the priesthood while courting the favor of the Ptolemies against their rivals, Antiochus Epiphanes and his line, okay? And so you have a lot of motive. When we go to court, we look at motive, we look at evidence, we look at facts, and we look at motive. There is a lot of motive for the Maccabees to want to see a Bible conform to the fact that they're now ruling in what they claim to be the Messiah. And so they alter Daniel, they alter prophecies about the branch, they alter the timeline to go with Egypt's history because they're courting the Ptolemies. And then, lo and behold, in First Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus is literally writing to Aristobulus, who's a scholar, and he was a former tutor to Ptolemy IV, and he's telling him, oh, we have all the books you need. We've recollected the library of books that Nehemiah brought back from the captivity. So he's basically telling you, we have the biblical canon. And that's when all the Apocrypha start to enter in. And that's when all the changes start to happen. And all these changes happen to just coincide with claims that the Maccabees are making, as if the abomination of desolation has come to pass. And the Feast of Tabernacles that is mentioned in Zechariah under the Messiah is what they're keeping. And that's what Hanukkah is. It's literally in 1st and 2nd Maccabees that it's another Feast of Tabernacles. That's what they say. And it just so happens in the generation where all these biblical changes seem to be happening, you have the Maccabees start to name their sons Aristobulus. The same name as the guy who is this scholar. And this scholar in Egypt also happens to be teaching people that Greek philosophy started with Moses. So there's just this massive pile. Again, it's circumstantial evidence, but you have a lot of motive and a lot of circumstantial evidence that there was a goal to syncretize Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish history as the cultural norm that was going to infiltrate the Greco-Roman sphere and have the Jews be a centerpiece of that under the Maccabees, with the Ptolemies and the Romans. That seems to be what they were trying to build, a new world order based around a new academic consensus, based around altered writings, lies and myths, and hidden Gnostic teachings. That seems to be what happened, okay? People will look at that and they'll say, I can't keep up with all that stuff you just put together, and I don't want to do that research, and I'll tell you what my seminary professor told me, so therefore you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, people who don't want to think too hard are always calling people conspiracy theorists when they don't want to think too hard. But again, answer my questions. Well, none of these guys are. And I'm on their channels and I'm asking the questions, and they'll respond, and if I say something positive, they'll respond to that. If I say something critical or questioning, they won't respond to that. That's how I know they're covering something up. And what they're probably covering up is just that they just don't know, but they're not about to go against the institutional consensus, because that's where their credibility lies. They don't want to be looked at as a conspiracy theorist, even if there was an actual conspiracy. And we need to start out as conspiracy theorists to show that that conspiracy was a fact eventually. That's how conspiracies are uncovered. They start as a conspiracy theory, and then they turn into a factual proposition. Okay? So anyways, that's why I'm against the LXX chronology, and so I'm building this book based on the Masoretic chronology, which I think is a lot more simple. When you go to the Assyrians Kings list, this is really simple. You have a Sargon I around the time of Abraham. You have Naram-Sin around the time of Abraham. Okay? Now, we know that the Assyrians modeled Sargon II on Sargon I because he was a hero of theirs, because he established their first cities. Sargon didn't conquer Assyria. He just went up into Syria, established their cities, brought irrigation farming, which massively increased their food supply, and turned them from being a bunch of tent-dwelling shepherd lords, basically shepherd chiefs, like Bedouins, into a city, into a culture, and into eventually an empire. They credit that to Sargon. So they don't look at him as an evil tyrant. They look at him as a guy who legitimately ruled over them, who brought civilization to them. And so they have no motive to obscure when Sargon lived. He's a hero to them. And what do they have? Well, they have Sargon living around the time of Abraham. Your scholars, because they're following the LXX, your Christian scholars, which is following the Manetho and the Sumerian Kings list, they push Sargon back about 400 to 500 years from that. Why? Because they're aligning things with Egyptian chronology. That was the academic consensus back then, because the Greeks believed, and you can read their philosophical writings, that the Egyptians have saved records through multiple floods, multiple cataclysms, and that these things just happen periodically according to the alignment of the stars. There was never one great big Noahic flood. There was just a bunch of floods where the civilizations that were largely built on the rivers were destroyed and then rebuilt. But the Egyptians, who carved their histories and their writings into stones, they knew better. And that's what they taught to the Greeks. It's in two of Plato's books that the Egyptians are teaching to Solon, okay? So we know the Greeks believed this. They believe the Egyptians have the best history. Well, why? Well, their stuff's written in stone, so therefore it's the best history. Yeah, but when was it written in stone? See, they don't ask those questions. And the answer to those questions is after they overthrew the Jews and tried to erase them. After they overthrew the original Egyptian kingdom with the Israelites, that's when they wrote all that history. And we know, based on things that line up and the massive differences in these kings lists, which I've gone over in other videos, that the Egyptians are full of crap. They're usurpers, just like Sargon and the Sumerians are usurpers, and they're writing fake history after their writings, and they're all trying to say the same thing. We were descended from the gods. History is much older than you think, but we're the oldest civilization, and so therefore we have the right to rule the entire world as basically the global hegemon, which America is right now, okay? The global hegemon does not mean you have control over every facet of the world, but you have dominance over the world's economy and over the world militarily. And that's where America is right now, okay? Egypt was that in the time of Joseph, and trying to maintain that they have always been that in the time of Moses, okay? It was a lie, but it's the same thing with Sargon. Sargon was trying to maintain that he was the original king of the whole world. He was supposed to be the king. He was appointed by Noah after Noah died. They call Noah Anu, and they literally merged the name for the sky and the name for Noah. The Egyptians called him Nu, so that was the Hamitic name for him. So Nu is Noah, An is sky, and they merge them together to form the god Anu. Just like they take Shem and Ash, which means fire, and make him Shamash, and that's the sun god. Okay? They're taking people and they're deifying them by merging them with primordial elements or aspects of nature after they die, and they turn them into gods. And he does the same thing with Sin. That's the head of the Sinites, where Shinar gets his name and makes him a moon god, and that's how they're building their pantheon. So we know they're making fake religion. That's propaganda. We know they're making fake history. That's propaganda. And we know the archaeological record really doesn't support this. We know the archaeological record supports the existence of some of these histories going back to like 3000 BC, but that's because a lot of these are pre-flood cities that are dug up. And what your LXX proponents are going to tell you is nothing survived the flood. Everything was washed over. The world was radically changed, broken up. Nothing survived the flood. And that's just not true. We have in the ancient histories claims that people were digging up stones and tablets and writings and stuff in clay and stuff in stone that was from before the flood, and that's where they got paganism from. They're saying it way back then, okay? So you have to understand, unless your city is sitting underneath a mountain, it's not going to get buried by mud. Yes, it's going to get washed over by water and probably going to have some sediment on it, but that sediment's not going to be so heavy that you can't ever find it again, which is why we're using LiDAR, and we're finding civilizations, some of them that are probably pre-flood. They were just covered with mud. Stone doesn't dissolve. It's stone. And that's what these guys built out of. And we dig down in the stone, we find all kinds of stuff, and sometimes we find pottery and stuff mixed in, and then sometimes we find carbon dated material, and even though there's some issues with carbon dating, it still gives us a relative age to it, even if there's some error in it. But when we get to things like when, for instance, Hammurabi ruled, who was basically the last unified ruler of Mesopotamia before it fell apart, they can't pin him down within 100 years. They're literally like it's sometime between the time of Isaac and the time of Joseph. They don't know. They have a lot of theories. But what they end up with is that as those theories progress, the newest and most modern theories put Hammurabi almost exactly at the time that Joseph and his family go into Egypt, and they're using a translator. And it just so happens that Hammurabi was known to build this great tower in Babel to Marduk. And so they're dating him around the time that the Israelites are using a translator for the first time, around the time where there's a great global famine because the world's economy is disrupted, and around the time that this guy's building a great tower. That's what we have from the archaeological record. Now, your average Christian seminary student, your average Bible college student, they don't care about this. They're not going to school to study apologetics, to build a YouTube channel to argue with pagans. They're going to study to be a pastor in the church, to learn, and I'm going to tell you what seminaries teach you. Half of what you learn is business. It's the business of church doing, church planning, church growth, church management, psychology. It's all this business stuff, okay? Then you're going to take like literally half a dozen classes at best to cover the entire Bible. Sometimes it's 4 classes. It's like 2 on the Old Testament and 2 on the New. If you go to a more thorough school, it might be 6 classes on the Bible. 6 classes. 6 classes. I had twice that many classes on history when I was going to be a social studies teacher, and history was only one of 4 disciplines that we were going to cover. And yet I took twice as many history classes as the people going to teach the Bible for a living take Bible classes. That's how bad it is, okay? And then they teach your systematic theology classes, which depending on the school is going to be 3 to 4 classes, which is mostly telling you what to think the Bible means, but not really teaching you to study the Bible. And then you take 1 class on hermeneutics, which is actually teaching you methods of interpreting and studying the Bible, and then 1 class on research and writing, which is going to teach you how to basically research and write papers. And the rest of what you take are pastoral classes, classes on spiritual disciplines that teach you how to pray. Like you need a class on how to pray, and then teach classes on homiletics and teaching you how to sound really authoritative and confident and eloquent when you preach. Because again, they're in the business of creating churches and creating employees for churches. These are not scholarly institutions as we would count scholarship. I could tell you the quality of a degree and what you're getting in most seminaries would not qualify as a master's program in most secular universities, because they're not teaching you to think critically. They're teaching you to absorb a standard and then go out to be employed in that standard. That's what it is. And so when you get all the way up to the people in the PhD level of these places, even they are not bucking the system at all. They're not challenging the system. The ones that are challenging the system, unfortunately, are the liberals. And then the liberals are going to have all these Gnostics and people who are just not Christians at all, and people who just don't believe anything was literally true in the Bible. But they'll at least allow you to challenge the norm. And so those are your choices of academia. And what's more conservative is going to be mostly dominated by Presbyterians and Baptists, in the U.S. at least. Anglicans and Presbyterians in England, and Lutherans, probably Calvinists, Lutherans and Calvinists and Catholics in Europe. And then the more liberal ones are going to be a lot of Anglicans, Episcopalians, stuff like that. But they're just going to be far more liberal and skeptical in how they do things. Okay, so there just aren't great schools of Christians who want to go to do the hard academic work to challenge the secular world. There's not schools dedicated to that. Okay. So, anyways, based on that, I give a look at Sumer that is actually going to be based around the Masoretic text chronology, and then I correct the date of the Babel event to the time of Joseph. And so that's my introduction. I throw out the LXX because I recognize that there's a lot of historical whitewashing and a lot of propaganda based around its writing. I correct the dating of Sumer based on the Masoretic text and the Assyrians' kings list rather than Sumerians' kings list, because I understand that to be based around a lot of propaganda. All these things have in common, just so you know, is dynastic overthrows. So when somebody overthrows somebody's dynasty, look for whitewashed and altered propaganda history. That's what you're going to find. This is something a historian is going to understand very simply, and a seminarian who is not a historian is not going to understand, so they're going to call it a conspiracy theory. Okay? But historians understand, no, we have a lot of history of dynastic overthrows, and what we have afterwards is a lot of changes in the historical records and a lot of destruction, banning, or censoring of the records of the previous dynasty. That's what we have. This is a normal thing. And since we know the Maccabees to be not so holy and murdering their own citizens and fighting with each other and murdering each other over who gets to rule, we're not going to assume that they're prophets and everything they did was on the up and up. See, that's how reasonable people think, not conspiracy theorists. But if you're institutional sycophants who just want to get your high degrees and get your Bible teaching and then grow your YouTube channel huge, well, then you're going to come up with theories that say, nope, the official records are definitely on the up and up. And here's the consensus view that we're coming up with, that also the secularists honor in their official records, those Bible haters honor, because that will give us the least amount of pushback. And so what we can do as Christians is we can roll around what the world is saying and say, no, we're relevant too. We just believe in a gap theory. Things like that, which they've been doing since the 1800s. Oh, we're relevant too. We just believe God used evolution. Yup, they'll do that too. Oh, we're relevant too. We just believe the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text. See, so they get less pushback from the world when they're claiming that the world is wrong on major things like Christ rose from the dead and he's God. And they fold on everything else, on prophecy, on history, on the flood, on everything else. They fold so they can hold on to, but we believe in the death and resurrection of Christ because a lot of people thought it was true. Well, that's fine, but a lot of people thought Buddha was God too, and they were willing to die for it too. So it doesn't matter. Faith is faith. Evidence is evidence. But we should do a better job of challenging the evidence. Because the amount of mundane details that are throughout the Old Testament about historical landmarks and stuff that's like, and that's how this town got its name. Okay? It seems really pointless and mundane to say that's how this town got its name. But when somebody is claiming, yeah, that was written 1,000 years later, and nobody even knows where that town is, and they probably didn't know 1,000 years later when we're claiming they wrote it, it makes no sense that they would say that's how this town got its name or that's how this pillar or pile of stones got its name. If you're making it up and nobody can go look at that pile of stones and say, oh, that exists. But it does make sense if it was written 1,000 years earlier where everybody knew where that stone was and everyone knew where that town was and everyone knew where that person was buried. But then that information was lost over 1,000 years because they're contemporary records from their period. And it just so happens they're counting all the major civilizations that archaeology digs up. The Aramaeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Arabians, the Canaanites. They're all documented in the places that they were accurately, with stories that fit the culture, they fit the supply chain, they fit the geopolitical scenario, they fit the construction tools and elements that they're using for building, they fit the technology that was available at that time. Everything just matches up to the history. And it's absurd, it's absolutely absurd that these scholars are to come around later and say, oh, that was invented in the days of Josiah 1,000 years afterwards. No. Things change over 1,000 years. There's no way they would know where that city is 1,000 years later. That's been overthrown by 3 wars. And just so we know it's been overthrown by 3 wars, we see it because we have disruptions in their genealogical and chronological records. Why? Because their city was overthrown. Their kingdom was overthrown. It just said 10,000 people were murdered. So guess what? Somebody forgot when Grandpa's birthday was, because he's dead, and the next 3 generations are dead, and 5 of them were taken into slavery, and there's nobody left who knows. So surprise, we have gaps in David's genealogy. Surprise, that's what happens in real life. But we do know that they were descended from this clan, and that's all over the Book of Chronicles. So we can sit here and go, well, I know the Fochmans came from Germany, and the McGowans, which is my mom's maiden name, came from Scotland, but I don't know their family lines back beyond maybe the 1800s. That's how it was back then. That's exactly how it was. Why? Well, for us, it was lost to history, but for them, they were dead. The people who would have known were dead, their records were burned, their city were burned, and that's how we have the records. And we also have the records of the wars and the conquests and why they were conquered and why they were taken into captivity and why their city was destroyed, so that we can know this isn't just arbitrary. And if somebody's making stuff up, they would have closed those gaps. But we leave the errors there. We leave the missing information there. We don't make stuff up because that's what you do when you're wanting to keep an accurate record. Okay? And these are things that, again, you don't have people going to seminary or to Christian institutions to study and learn history. History. Okay? what you have is people who kind of like me nerd out on it, and so they come up with some details and some stuff, but that stuff is very recent. And you need to understand that guys like Doug Petrovich and what is his name? I think it's David Roll. These guys are like from the past 20 years. And they're very niche, and they don't agree with each other, and they have PhDs or masters or whatever, but there's not a body of people to bounce these ideas off, and so you have very few people who are trying to iron these off. And I consider myself one of those people. I don't have a master's, I don't have a PhD, but I've just been studying it for a long time, and I've been bouncing off of their work, and this is something that sadly Christian institutions and Christian universities should have had. We should have had much more substantive archaeological and historical departments. We should have. And they shouldn't have been shouldn't have been a problem for these schools to critique or challenge the Baptist or King James only or Calvinist consensus that's being taught in the theological and ministry prep departments. They should have been informing those departments. But unfortunately, a historical study on Calvinism will show you that it's rooted in Gnosticism. So guess what those institutions don't want much of? Historical critical analysis. Because they know a sound historical critical analysis is going to find out that Calvinism is a novelty that was brought into the church by Augustine. It doesn't match up to the period before Nicaea. And it just so happens your major institutions, your Lutheran, your Catholic, your Orthodox, and your Protestant Calvinists all have a stake in you believing that the Council of Nicaea was one big united church where there was nothing to see here, no funny business going on. And that's entirely not true. And it's the same thing with the oldest and best manuscripts. There's just one consensus, historically critical, analyzed Bible that everything was figured out the right way, and that was the original Bible. Nothing to see here, no funny business. Entirely untrue. And I'm telling you, I'm reading books that were recommended to me by, for instance, like a guy with a master's degree who worked for Wycliffe Bible Society and was off in the jungles of South America translating the Bible. And he's saying, read this book on textual analysis. And I read it, and what they do is they go, the Textus Sinaiticus, even though there's this whole history of potential like funny business about how it came into existence and whether or not it might be a forgery and they could prove it, but they won't. They're saying that these same academic textual critics, remember, Wycliffe Bible Society, is saying, oh, Origen did all of the work. Origen and his school basically did all the work of textual criticism to come up with a very refined, perfect Bible. What they don't mention is the books that were added and the books that were missing from that Bible. Or the fact that Origen and his school were a bunch of heretics that were essentially teaching Brahmanism. They leave those parts out. So I challenge the consensus. This is what I do. And this is what the book is. It's based on the challenge consensus view, and what I am trying to do as much as possible, as much as I'm able, theoretically if I need to, is line up to the Masoretic text. And so I have my first chapter, Legends of the Old Gods, and this is summarizing using some linguistic and etymological analysis, some archaeological analysis, and then stuff that's in the Bible as well as in comparative mythology to summarize what seems to have happened, where Nephilim came from, where the first pagan religions came from, where astrology and fatalistic determinism and divination came from, and why these things were persuasive to people. And then I go from there to the Babel effect, and I show what happened after Babel in terms of the dispersion of religious ideas, which are mostly Canaanite ideas from the region of Babel. Remember, the Amorites were Canaanites, the Sinites were Canaanites, and the Sumerians were Canaanites. There's Zemar, Sin, and Amor. Those are the three Canaanite patriarchs of those guys. So literally the dominant people who spread from the region of Babel were all Canaanites. And they're the ones who produced the Nephilim, and they're the ones who dug up the astrology and all the stuff from before the flood. So I traced the spread of those ideas around the world. I read comparative mythologies, like just so you know, like this is like I think this is UCLA. This is like a top scholar at UCLA. Another one was a top scholar at Oxford that I was reading. And I'm reading their comparative mythology, and theirs is based on old Earth and ice ages and, glacial ice is melting, producing flood legends. And I just challenge that. I say, no, I think there's a worldwide flood that happened in the days of Noah, and then a rising the sea levels that happened around the death of Ham. And those two things turn into two distinct flood legends, and then in a lot of these cultures where they just have oral traditions, they merge them together. It's that simple. And so I take that, and I take the major ideas that are merging, and I map them to major places like West Africa, Mesoamerica, China, India, and then in the immediate Middle East. And then I take the major myth themes, which most of these academics are going to look at and say, these are the common myth themes, which are basically, think of a myth theme as like breaking down a story to its constituent elements. Like, what are the pieces of the story that's made up of? So for instance, with the Noah's Ark story, you would have, he sends out a bird. Okay, well, how many flood legends have him sending out a bird? Well, of those that don't have him sending out a bird, what is he sending out a bird for? To see if there's land. Well, some of them have him sending out an animal, not a bird. But most of them have a bird. And most that have a bird have some kind of bird that is like a dove and then a crow. They almost all have a crow. So we have two kinds of birds. So we take all these details and we map them together. And I don't do this in a big scientific diagram. I just do it in my head. And I go, okay, so what are we finding? The majority of the common elements in the majority of the flood myths of the 200 plus around the world map to Noah's being the original. And the closer you are to Ararat, the more of those details are going to match the Bible, which flies in the face of the archaeological consensus that the first one was the Atrahasis myth and these Enuma Elish and stuff like this, and then the Bible modified those. Those don't match the stuff around Ararat at all. The Bible does. So the original story came from, surprise, surprise, Ararat, where the Noah's flood legend is, and the biblical one is going to have most details shared with that Ararat region. And it just so happens the biblical narrative is the most complete version of the story, with the most rational version of what happened, and the most rational arc, and the most rational consensus of what happened afterwards. And so we go, okay, the Bible's true. And when you're closer to the Ararat region, remember they had a Tower of Babel, so everyone's confused, but your details are going to be closer because they're closer to the ark itself, the remnants of the ark, and the people who were closest related to Noah and Japheth who are buried in the region. So that's an example of what I do. And I go through all this, and I don't go into exhaustive detail, but I give you a summary of what happened with Babel. So I've got Legend of the Old God, the Babel effect, and then the next age is the age of Egyptian hegemony. And think of Egypt as like the America of that day. Joseph comes into Egypt. God is supernaturally giving Joseph divine revelation of what's coming from the Babel effect, so that Joseph can prepare Egypt to have plenty of food, and not only plenty of food, but to take all the land of Egypt under the control of the monarchy, and take these 7 nations of Egyptian people who now have their tongues confused, and have them moved across the nation to work different lands, to organize a system where everybody is forced to learn a common language. And so they're all learning Coptic. And that's how Egypt goes from 7 tribes with 7 different languages immediately after the Tower of Babel to one common Egyptian language and 7 nations, when the world is 70 nations. So they're 10% of the world's nations, plus the Jews, plus the Israelites. But they're united. They're speaking the same language immediately. And then the Israelites are united with the Mitanni or Aram Naharim, which are the descendants of Nahor that are all throughout the Bible. That's where Laban comes from. That's where Rebecca and Rachel and Leah come from. Okay? And so they're connected to these people. And so what you have is kind of like an alliance that you have with America and Europe, with Egypt and the Mitanni. And they become this really powerful empire for about 150 years, and they crush everything. They take over Canaan. They have cities as far away as Greece. They have Crete and Cyprus and all these islands all around them. They're dominating the Cushites to the south, the Puntites all the way to the Red Sea. They're expanding into Libya, which is the Libyans are actually an Egyptian tribe, and they're the world hegemony. Okay, they're the America of their day. And then I show how the Egyptian religion evolved from what was pre-flood gods and legends that were built around kings and stuff and people claiming to be God and stuff like that, all the way to what becomes the Book of the Dead, which is written around the time that the Israelites are put into captivity. And I talk about how, again, this is more theoretical, but how the priests, who were the only people who Joseph didn't move into their lands, how they or didn't move from their lands, were allowed to, one, maintain the languages they had, which is why you have a bunch of stuff with multiple spellings in Egyptian, and two, maintain a lore and a religious tradition that was contrary to the primary Egyptian tradition, which was based around the priesthood at On, which Joseph was married into. So he marries the daughter of the high priest of Ra. Okay, so Joseph is second to the Pharaoh, married into the high priest at Ra, and surprise, surprise, we have all the pharaohs having Ra in their last name, in their throne names, up until the time the Israelites are overthrown, when they stop using Ra in the end of their name, and they start using words like Ammon is born, Thoth is born, and the born part is the word Moshe, which is the Hebrew word for Moses. Okay, so literally Moshe, it's probably originally an Egyptian word that the Hebrews borrowed, literally means is born. So Moses just means he is born, because he doesn't have he's supposedly divine born, he's a type of Christ, and his name just means he is born. Okay, but they have all these other people when the Jews are overthrown mean Thoth is born, Ammon is born, Yah, which is their moon god, is born, and you end up with and just so you know, Yah was a shortened form of Yahweh that had been around for hundreds of years before the Egyptian sun god Yah ever existed. That's not an accident, because the Israelites there's also syncretic Israelites that are among the Egyptians creating new gods like the Apis bull cult, which is what they have when they build the they build the image of the beast at Mount Sinai, the bull calf. Okay. So anyways, I walk through all that, and that takes you right to the time of Moses when he's a prince, and I talk about how, they overthrow the old order, and then they put in the new order, and so they start writing all this religious and historical propaganda. They extend their history back beyond what they know to be the oldest history, which is basically the era of Sargon and all that. And so they're writing a history of Egypt as if it extends before the flood, and they're erasing the memory of the flood. So this is a major thing that Peter warns about as a last days problem, as people being willfully ignorant of the flood. And that erasing of the flood seems to happen with the Egyptians, and they seem to start doing it around the time they're overthrowing the Israelites who believe in the flood, which makes sense, okay? So then I have the next chapters of Revelation of Yahweh, and that I have going over what the Near East would have been like after the Babel event, how Yahweh reveals himself to Moses, and how the Code of Hammurabi, which is about 100 years before, based on my chronology, it's about 100 to 150 years. It's probably about 200 years before the law is given at Mount Sinai or Horeb. And I compare the two laws, and I show there's stuff that was probably common Semitic law when Shem was ruling the world as Melchizedek, and then how the law is basically better on every point, especially to women. Okay. Especially to women, and especially to slaves and the orphans, widows and orphans, stuff like that. So anyways, I go into there, and I go into what happened with Joshua takes the promised land, and how he conquered all the way up to north of Lebanon and all the way back down into Goshen in Egypt. That's what Joshua conquered. And they reoccupy Goshen. The Danites and probably some Judites reoccupy it. And then after that, you have Othniel, who is in Joshua. He is he's basically like I think a great grandson or great grandnephew of Caleb. But if you remember, Caleb is 80 by that time, so he would have been, probably in around 20 when they enter in the promised land. And then when he's a middle-aged man, around, after Joshua dies, he goes and fights the Kassites, who are coming from the Aramean region, which is Syria. It's basically Syria between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And he goes and fights these guys. And the main tribe of the Israelites who are in charge are called the Calebi, or the Calebites, because they're descended from, you have these three sons of Hezron, which is Ram, Caleb, and Jeremiel. Okay, and Ram is where David's line comes from. Caleb is where Caleb's line comes from, and Jeremiel is less significant. Okay, and these Calebi are mentioned in the Kadesh inscription, which is the Pharaoh. What is his name? Ramses. I think it's Ramses the second. When he goes to fight the Hittites in the last great attempt at Egypt to control Canaan. And he goes and fights the Hittites, and this is during the days of Othniel, or after the peace of Othniel, and the Egyptians and the Hittites basically fight each other to a standstill, totally weaken each other's armies, and they don't ever try to basically exert political or military force into Canaan again. Okay, so that happens during the first one of the Judges. And then it's after that Akhenaten starts the cult of Aten-Ra, which seems to be him trying to return to almost a tritheism or a trinity of the sun god, Aten, which is basically based on the setting sun, which seems to be based on Yahweh meeting Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening. And then these hands that come out of them that are the sun's rays that are meant to be like the Holy Spirit. Okay, so he seems to start some kind of cult, but in this cult, he makes himself the Son of God. But it seems to be modeled on, I'm going to be honest, it seems to be modeled on the biblical Trinity. Does he know the Jews? We don't know, but we know he has records from his father of the Hebrews taking over all these cities in Canaan that used to be their vassals. So he seems to have enough of a record of the Israelites, and this is only less than 100 years, or maybe about 100 years after the Israelites leave Egypt, that know that these people are now taking over Canaan that left Egypt. So is he trying to return back to a time when Egypt was peaceful with the Israelites and Joseph was married in the priesthood of Ra and Egypt had its glory days? It seems to be. But he gets overthrown by his priests, which are mostly centered around a cult to Ammon, who is Ham, and they put his son Tutankhamun in place, which is Tut means I think is Thoth means something like Thoth is satisfied or something like that. And King Tut takes over, and King Tut dies young. So then I go to the serpent by the way. This chapter is about the Danites, because the Danites were occupying Goshen until Ramses II seems to push them out of Goshen, and then the Sea People's invasion starts. And the reason is because when the Egyptians, remember, he's before Akhenaten, okay? When the Egyptians were decimated by Yahweh, they don't come back to having their entire borders and their entire kingdom satisfied. Remember, they lose all their firstborn, they lose major chunks of their army in the Red Sea, and then after that, they seem to go into Canaan to get a bunch more slaves to try to, bring back their population, which the Israelites seem to have been up to half of them, which means when the Israelites leave, they have a bunch of just empty space and empty cities. They don't have the people to just take over these cities because their population's been decimated, okay? And so what you have is about a century of where Egypt is mostly consolidated around the Upper Nile and trying to maintain their control over the Nubians. And that allows the Danites to go retake Goshen, and they seem to restart a sea trade there and immediately get up into Crete, up into Greece, up into Cyprus, and up into southern Turkey, and up into eastern Turkey. And that all seems to happen within about 100 to 150 years between Joshua and the fall of Troy. And this Joshua, remember, is going to start in the 1300s. The fall of Troy is going to be around 1190. So it's about a 150-year period where the Danites seem to be expanding. We have significant records in Greek literature and Greek city names and just circumstantial stuff archaeologically that point to this, but the Danites seem to be the main sea peoples. And then they have a confederacy that is with them because it's all based around the Danites controlling the bronze trade from the tin mines of Cornwall in England, Cornwall and Devon, all the way to Haifa, Israel. And so the sea peoples seem to be based around the Danites' control of that supply chain. And when the Danites get pushed out of Goshen, not only them, but all their seafaring allies in this supply chain try to reinvade Egypt and take that land back, take Goshen back. And what happens is Ramses II rises up and defeats them, incorporates some of them into his army, and then he has them as mercenary contingents when he goes to fight the Battle of Kadesh against the Calebi. These people called the Darduna, which Darduna seems to be the settlement of the Danites. That's who Dardana is. And then the Hittites. And so the Calebi, which seem to be Judahites, and the Dardana, which seem to be Danites, are fighting on the side of the Hittites against Ramses because they just got pushed out of Goshen not that long ago. And then the Sea Peoples were defeated by Ramses, which they keep trying for like the next 100 years, but they fail. And then some of their allies become Egyptian allies. And when Egypt basically gets beat to a standstill and they don't win, those allies go join with the Philistines. And that's how the Philistines start to get stronger against Israel. And it's in that period, not that long after that, you're going to have I go through the books of the Judges, that the Danites seem to continue to conquer because now the Hittites are pretty much weakened in Anatolia and the Egyptians are weakened in Egypt. They can't get a foothold in Egypt, and so what they do is they help the Japhethite peoples, which are the Greeks, and the Ludians, which are Semitic, and the Achaeans overthrow the Hittites and the Trojans. And the Trojans were like the main port city for bronze for the Hittites. So they overthrow these guys. The Danites seem to take over the bronze trade, and they're going to then, because their allies are now on the side of the Egyptians, they're going to start alternative routes for the bronze to go across France, down the Danube River, and towards this Dardana settlement, which is just north of Troy. Because remember, they've sacked Troy, and they're cutting Troy out of the market. And so they do that, and then the other Danites, because you have Danites who've been mixing with Greeks for probably centuries, and these Greek people, they're going to rebuild Troy, and then these Danites are going to be allies with them, while these other Greeks across the sea are going to be cut out of this bronze trade now. Well, they're going to come over and they're going to sack Troy. That's how the fall of Troy seems to happen. So all of this seems to happen in the generation before Samson is born. And when Samson is born, he is going to have it's about a 16 to 20 year period where he is mentioned as judging Israel, but he's not mentioned as doing anything. Well, what I theorize is that Samson took his parents and went to first Crete because he was getting away after the Philistines, remember, killed all his in-laws. And he had just killed 1,000 of them with the jawbone of a donkey. And these legends start popping up in Crete and in Achaia of this guy with a club with wearing a lion as like a headdress. And Samson killed a lion and killed a bunch of people with the jawbone of a donkey, which is essentially a club. And all these stories start popping up with this legend of Hercules, which seems to mean glory of Hera, and Hera means she who became pregnant, and it just so happens that Samson's mom is not named in the book of Judges. So she's just a woman who became divinely pregnant. And this would match up with their lore of Asherah, which literally means the woman who became pregnant. And so what I theorize is that the Minotaur, Perseus, and Hercules are all based on Samson, because all those stories are going to emerge about 300 years later. It's not like they're old or original. They're legendary stories that emerge like 300 years later, but they all seem to be based on Samson. And so I kind of tie that theory together and explain how I don't believe Samson was before the Trojan Wars. There might have been, even some of these names like Perseus and Hercules maybe were real guys that were involved in the Trojan Wars, but probably not. And what seems to happen is when Homer writes the story on the Trojan Wars, he is borrowing from Phoenician records, which is where the Greeks get their alphabet, of actual kings and stuff, but they don't line up date-wise to the era of the Trojan destruction. But that's because he's writing like 400 years later. He doesn't know the actual history, and so he's borrowing names that are in ancient histories, but they're like 100 years off. And so it seems like that's how Hercules, or which is I believe is Samson, gets pulled into the stories around the Trojan Wars. Okay, so and this makes sense. This is around the same time. This is literally the same generation that the city of Dan is getting destroyed by the Assyrians. It's literally within 50 years of this. That's when the Greeks start using the phonetic alphabet and start writing Homer and Hesiod and guys like this. And it's also in that same generation that we have pederasty starting in Crete, and that is largely around the myths of the satyr, which is a sex demon. So you'll see all these vases in Greece with basically a goat man with an erection. Well, the goat man is the satyr, and it's actually the Hebrew word for demon. It's sayer, which basically means a shaggy goat. Okay, and so these sayers, who also would carry a flute. So think Mr. Tumnus on Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He was a satyr. Okay. And the flute was how they would seduce women, supposedly, and men to seduce them sexually. And so we have archaeological finds of images of stuff like this in Tel Dan. And we have this as in Hebrew, in the words themselves for demons and stuff like that. Liliths and satyrs are basically male and female sex demons, and it goes back to Nephilim. It's basically the ghosts of Nephilim. Okay, this goes all the way back to ancient Sumer, and I explain all this stuff, and then those start to pop up in Crete after Dan is destroyed. And what also pops up after Dan is destroyed is a version of a god named Bethel, and Yahoo and Bethel as related to Dagon and El and Baal in Tyre. And that seems to travel down to Egypt, where Tyre is still trading, to become the Elephantine priesthood. And you seem to have a version of it in southern Judah, which is based on Asherah and Yahweh as a husband and wife. And then that seems to travel to Egypt, which is based on Yahoo or Yahweh and Anat, which was the sister of Baal, I believe, in the Canaanite mythology. But the Danites seem to be mixing all this stuff together in Tyre and spreading it to Greece and Egypt, which makes sense. Those are the main two places Tyre is trading with. They're really trading with the whole world, but those are the main two places they're trading with. And then you find out that all of the Greek philosophy comes from Tyre, Phoenicia, Alexandria, Egypt, or Sais, Egypt, which is where King Necho brought Josiah's son. So you have Jewish influences there. And then Athens and Samos, which is off the coast of Anatolia, which is where you have Pythagoras and Thales and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and these guys. Those are the main two places. And then there's the Pythagorean school, which also started in Samos but was over in Italy too. But it's literally like mostly two locations. It's off the coast of Miletus, and then it's around the Athens region, and then Phoenicia, and then Sais, which moves to Alexandria. So it's those four locations that all of the major philosophies come from. And it just so happens what they all have in common is Danites. Danites seem to be spreading to all of them. So what I conclude is that the serpent, by the way, and most of your Greek philosophy, which is eventually going to emerge in Buddhist and Hindu stuff as well as Egyptian mystery stuff, the main coordinating or the main connecting point with all that is the Danites. And are they a pure tribe of Danites at this time? No, but they are mentioned in the days of the Maccabees from a record that goes back to around 300 BC that the Spartans know that they're descended from Abraham. They're uncircumcised, but they know they're descended from Abraham. Okay? So I pull all that together into a feasible theoretical narrative. My next chapter is the Semitic Age of Empires, which I really look at the ancient Near East from a lens that the Bible is true and that the kingdom of David and Solomon was right up there with Egypt and Assyria in terms of power. And I mean Egypt and Assyria at their height. Okay. The reason they weren't more expansive is because they weren't called to be by Yahweh. But they basically controlled all the way up to the Euphrates River, which is where the Aram Naharim are, and David defeats them, and they're actually under the control of the Assyrians at that time. And so David basically defeats tributary kingdoms that are under the control of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians don't step to David. The Egyptians won't try to touch David, and then David's son marries in with the Egyptians, and so their southern flank is totally covered, and Solomon ends up running trade routes that go all the way around to Spain and India, all the way to, while trading horses and chariots, all the way up to the Hittite, the failing Hittite states and the Aramean states that are opposed to the Assyrians. So basically Israel has the Assyrians hemmed in. They can't grow until Israel starts to fall apart. That's how Assyria grows. And so when Israel starts to fall apart, splits between Israel and Judah, and then Israel starts to ally. They're fighting Damascus at first, and then they start to ally with Damascus against Assyria, and the Judites start to pay off Syrians and then Assyrians against, or Arameans, I should say. Arameans are in Damascus. We call them Syrians today, but it's based on Assyria. So the Arameans, they're paying off Arameans against northern Israel, and then Assyrians against Arameans in northern Israel. And it's them buying off and giving money to the Assyrians to attack their immediate rival neighbors that leads to the Assyrians becoming so powerful that they eventually take Babylon and control the whole of Mesopotamia, and then they come and take northern Israel and try to take Judah. Okay, so it's really the Jews, it was theirs to lose, and they lose it, and they don't just lose it, they pretty much pay the Assyrians to become the new world empire, which is really stupid. But that's what they do. And then when the Assyrians would have stayed the world empire, except for getting 180,000 in an army killed by Yahweh. That's what happens. And then they start to decline after that. And so as they decline, the Babylonians start to rise. And I have learned that the Babylonians are descended from Abraham's brother. That's who they come from. They're called in the Bible Kesedim. And then the Kesedim are called by, I believe it's the Akkadians or Syrians, Keldu, and that's where they get the name Chaldeans from, but in the Bible they're consistently called Kesedim. So when you read that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans, it's actually Ur of the Kesedim. And what you end up having is those Aramean descendants who take with them the gods of Ur, like Inanna and Sin and Enlil and stuff like that. They go up to the region of Haran, and then after Babylonia falls, they go back down and they take Ur in the region around there, and they may become the Sea Peoples, but they definitely eventually become the Chaldeans. And so Nebuchadnezzar and all those guys are actually, they're related. They're descended from Abraham's brother. It's trying to think of what his name is, Haran and Nahor, and Nahor has, I believe, 4 grandsons, and one of them is named Kesed, and that's where he comes from. So basically, it's much more connected to Abraham than you believe. So, anyways, those people go back into worshiping the serpent Ningishada, or Ningishizda, I think his name is, and then it's after they're worshiping the serpent again that they send these envoys to Hezekiah to try to figure out how Hezekiah defeated Assyria. And Hezekiah shows off his wealth instead of giving glory to God. And so what they do is that sets God up to discipline Judah by saying you're going to go into captivity to the Babylonians. And that's the pattern that I show. It's not just that they're worshiping other gods. God allows them to be defeated by the people whose gods they're worshiping, which makes sense. If you worship Yahweh, he says, then I'll defeat all your enemies. But if you worship their gods, then they're going to defeat you. That's how Yahweh works with the Israelites. And so that's how they go into the captivity to Babylonia. And then it talks about how the Semitic age ends when the Medo-Persians take over. The Medo-Persians are iconoclasts. The Persians, not so much, but the Medes are. They destroy all the gods around them. They don't have idols themselves. And it's out of that the Medo-Persians are going to patronize the Magi, and the Magi are going to come up with Ahura Mazda, which is Zoroastrianism. I talk about Zoroastrianism, and I erase the idea that Zoroastrianism is this very ancient religion. It seems to be invented in the 6th century, though some of its lore and some of its mythology is older than that. But the actual religion, and Zoroaster himself is a guy who seems to have been the head of the Magi when Daniel was in charge, and then basically became the expert of all the Babylonian religion after Daniel leaves and goes to Susa. And so I talk about that, and then I give you a history of the Japhethite faith coming from basically Ararat and the Oxus Valley civilization, going all the way down to the religions of the Greeks and the Romans and the Hindus and the Persians. And I summarize all that. And then I get into the era of Cyrus down through Alexander the Great, where the Jews are very influential in the court of the Persians and among the Magi, because Daniel saved all their lives in Babylon. And so Zoroastrianism seems to borrow a lot from Judaism. And those ideas, I get into some of those ideas that are in the Zoroastrian, it's called the Behishhtun, which is basically like their creation myth and their history. And I show how a lot of these ideas from Zoroastrianism are actually just borrowed from Judaism. That disagrees with the mainstream of academia, but the mainstream of academia just will say that all the stuff, they hate everything in the Bible, but if it's in Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, they'll be like, oh yeah, even though our written records are like 3,000 years after that, we believe that that's all not only old, but accurate. It's like they have a complete opposite approach to Aryan stuff as they have to Semitic stuff, which makes sense because actually all these academic institutions and their biases go back to the age of Pan-Aryanism and Anglo-American supremacy in the pre-Nazi era. That's why. It's in literally the century before the Nazis, where people are trying to prove that Aryan stuff is older than Semitic stuff and turning away from the Bible. So I get into all that. And then I get into my chapter 8 is the dawn of the religious sage. And I walk through basically 3 main bodies of Greece, India, and China, and how they all go through this political era of political disruption. And within that context, the Greeks, it's because of democracy. The Indians, it's because the Kuru kingdom falls apart. And then it's in the period between the Kuru's kingdom falling apart and the rise of the Mauryan Empire that it's the empire of Chandragupta, Maurya Chandragupta or whatever. I think it's Mauryan. It might be it's the Mauryan Empire. So it's in that period of a couple hundred years, and just like in the Greek period of a couple hundred years of democracy, you have all of these philosophies popping up. And the reason is because in every case, they're trying to become the new religious order of the new world order when things settle back down into one big empire again. So I show how these things are very common, and then I go to China and show how the same thing happens there. When the Zhou dynasty falls, between the Zhou rising and then the Qin and the Han reconsolidating China as one big empire, you have what they call is the 100 schools of thought period, which is where all these different philosophies emerge trying to be the new state religion. Because remember, back then, religion, morality, and law were all tied together. And so what was expected from God or heaven or the gods, whatever they called it, tied into your legal proceedings, your politics, and everything you did. It's kind of like saying, the Jews are under Mosaic law. They're under their version of divine law. Okay? And we still have aspects of that in our own thing. That's why people were up into the 20th century are swearing on a Bible in court. It's a divine law. That's why you're swearing to testify before God, okay? And that's why you have deistic ideas that are in our Constitution and in our Declaration of Independence. They believe in a creator, and they say because we believe in this creator, we have inalienable rights on that basis. So they have the same thing in India, China, and Greece, okay? They're just more religious, more superstitious than we might consider ourselves. But remember, we were not even 100 years away from witch burning by the time we started our democracy in America. So the superstition's everywhere, okay? So anyways, what I show is that there's these periods of all these new philosophies popping up in this period of political disruption. And we have the same thing that goes on with the Greeks, and then we have the same thing that goes on in the Reformation era, and then the same thing that goes on when England loses its power as the global hegemony, okay? As you have new political powers starting to form, you have new religious or philosophical powers trying to assert themselves as the ethical, spiritual backbone of the New World Order, okay? So I summarize all this and I give you kind of a root history of all of your major philosophical sages and your religious sages of India, China, and Greece. Then I take you to the rise of Greco-Romanism, which becomes the new hegemony after Egypt. It was first Egypt, and then it was the Persians. The Semitic are not really one big empire. You just have phases of people being dominant. And then the Persians are dominant for a long time. And then the Greco-Romans become dominant. And so I walk you through that history, which culminates in the Alexandrian Library. And just so you know, there's some mistakes here because this is not the final copy that I post. But the Alexandrian Library, I take you to where all these religious ideas, including stuff as far away as India and Southeast Asia, all the way over into stuff having to do with like the Druids as far as England, is all being consolidated in Alexandria. These ideas are being syncretized, they're being shared, and right smack dab in the middle of that, from Ptolemy II, you have a community of around 150,000 Jews. And what you have is about a third of them come from this military community that was serving Egypt from the time of Psamtik, the father of Necho, who kills Josiah, all the way to, because they're all vassals to Assyria. That's why they're serving Egypt. All the way to the period of the Persian conquest, when they're near Aswan and they're patronizing the Elephantine priesthood, all the way forward into the time of the Ptolemies, where they seem to gather in Alexandria with the remnants of the Elephantine priesthood. And then what gets added to them is about 100,000 Jews that are taken captive in the Diadochi Wars, which are the wars between Alexander's generals after Alexander the Great dies, okay? And so this community of 150,000 Jews are right there at the beginnings of the formation of the Alexandrian Library and all of this historical, scientific, geographical, and religious knowledge being collected from the whole world. And in the midst of that, you have a Jewish community that starts to claim that they were the OG, that Abraham was the author of astrology, that Moses was the author of the Egyptian mysteries, and that all philosophy was borrowed from Moses, and Plato followed Mosaic stuff, Pythagoras followed Mosaic stuff, and they were just ripping stuff off from the Jews because the Jews were the OG ancient philosophers. That's what they're claiming, okay? And this culminates with a guy named Aristobulus, who ends up being the tutor to Ptolemy IV, so we're looking at about 100 years later. And it's around this period that the LXX starts to be getting written. And it's also around this period that the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs, all the Apocrypha, all the false stuff that these different Jewish sects that didn't get included in their canon is all being written in this period from the time that the Jews that are claiming that they're the central source of pretty much all philosophy, religion, and paganism. And they're claiming that there's the bad stuff because the Greeks are getting away from idolatry, like physical idols and stuff like that, and worship of demons. But the stuff that's more systematic and the stuff that's more logical, they're claiming that it came from Abraham and Moses. So from there, I get into the corruption of Second Temple Judaism, and I show how these root elements corrupted Judaism to form the Pharisees are actually the least corrupted, but it's the Sadducees and the Essenes that are the most corrupted. The Essenes are essentially Greek philosophical syncretists. The Sadducees are Greek philosophical syncretists. Philo is a Greek philosophical syncretist, but the Essenes are actually mystics. and they seem to be influenced by Buddhism, Brahmanism, the Egyptian mysteries, and then a bunch of writings that they make up and claim an angel delivered. So I get into all that stuff, leading to, I go over all the different groups' literature and what's wrong with it, and then I show how that turns into the decline and fall of Judea, which starts with the Maccabees and ends with Bar Kokhba. So you're talking about a period from about 160 BCE to about 130 CE. So it's about a 300-year period. Okay, so this is where Judea just goes to pot, and right smack dab in the middle of that is Jesus, and they unite briefly to kill Jesus and drive out his apostles, and then they completely fall to crap. Okay. Then I show from my last chapter, which is about 40 pages, I kind of summarize the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of the Sadducees, and the leaven of the Herodians, or the Essenes, in church history. If you want a more thorough exposition of this, you get my Rightly Dividing book, and that's where I cover that. And then I take that forward to the reintroduction of Gnosticism and Theosophy, which go all the way back to Alexandria, Egypt. Literally, Clement is the first person we have on record using the term Theosophy in ancient Greek or ancient Alexandria, and he also was trained in the Egyptian mysteries. So I show how Theosophy is just the bringing back of the Egyptian mysteries mixed with Greek philosophy, mixed with Hinduism and Buddhism. It's just reviving the stuff that was around Alexandria around the time of Christ's first coming, in preparation for the coming of Antichrist. And then I just lead it down to how really summarizing, because I have my whole book on the Revelation where I have this more thoroughly, how these religions seem to merge towards one based around, I call it robots versus aliens, but that's essentially AI versus Christ. So Christ is Thanos and AI is Ultron, and that's how we're going to put a suit of armor around the world and save ourselves from Jesus. That's how this false religion is going to go down. And then I just conclude with a summary about getting away from Gnosticism, getting away from conspiracy theory and rabbit hole stuff, and getting more into the Word, because ultimately, even though I spent all this time studying all this stuff outside of the Bible, the backbone of everything I measure it by is the Masoretic text, Old Testament, and the Textus Receptus, New Testament. I'm not King James only. I'm not TR only. I'm not Masoretic only. I just think they're better. And I give my reasons for that in my Apostles' Teaching book. I think we're more in danger of people taking stuff away from the Bible and changing the Bible politically than the stuff that was received historically. So that's what I just published. That is a serpent, by the way. That's kind of a summary of what the book's about. And over the next year, probably, what I'm going to do is, this book is live. It's my fourth book. God's kind of put it on my heart, since I was going to write House of God next, which I thought would be about maybe a 6-month write. God kind of put it on my heart to actually go through, like I did with the Apostles' Teaching, and write my own translation of the Old Testament. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the Old Testament down into 3 books. It's not going to be quite the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. I thought about doing it like that. But what I'm going to do is have a book called the Books of Moses, which is the Pentateuch. So that is essentially the law, and I'm about 3/4 through Genesis done already. I keep all the Bible names in there. So the names of God in there. If it says El Bethel, it's going to be El Bethel, God of Bethel. Elohim, this is actually a name for angels. It's a plural, so I'm going to say if it's singular or plural. I'm going to say if it's a plural singular, which is basically saying Elohim, but talking about Elohim as a single person. And I have all of those: Elohi, Elohe, El. And what I'm going to do in this is have a summary in the beginning of it that tells you what each of those names mean in its context, and all the possible meanings of it, so that you're reading the Bible with the actual names of God in there. And that is going to be the basis for when I write House of God, because what I am writing is a theology of the Godhead that totally kicks out Greek philosophy. That's what I'm doing. So I got to make sure I know the Godhead very thoroughly from the Old Testament usages, from the language itself. And also what I do is whenever Hebrew words are used, like Zebulun means dwelling place, Joseph means Yah adds. So we see Yah as a shortened form. There are people who will say Yah is the moon god of Egypt, and that's not true because the name Joseph means Yah adds. Okay, so we know that Yah came from Israel, not from Egypt, and the Egyptians probably ripped him off. So, but these are names for God. We know that El came from Joseph, and the Canaanites ripped him off and made him Baal's dad. Okay, so these stories come from hundreds of years before those other things exist. Okay, so what I'm doing is when he's called El Shaddai, he's called El Shaddai, and I'm using the actual biblical names for gods. And you're going to have, just like you have like a little glossary of terms in your other books that I write on history. I'm going to have Ha Elohim, Elohim, Ruach Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, Debar Elohim, Malak Yahweh. All the different terms that I come across, I'm going to put them in there, tell you what they mean, and tell you the forms of usage that they have in the Bible, so that when you read it with these names right in it, you know which name of God is and what that actually means. So you can look at that and go, okay, they use the Elohi word, but I'm going to break down what Elohi and El mean in their root languages to the best of my understanding. And then you can look at that and go, Elohi means the God of it, because it's usually used Elohi of Abraham. It's the God of Abraham. It's not a proper name. It is El is a shortened form of Elohim, and Elohim means basically God or gods. And then I'm going to put all those things in their proper context, who's using them, when, what books, and what languages, because sometimes they're different language groups, like Aramaic versus Hebrew. And you're going to have this in there. And what it should do, if you want to open yourself up to more knowledge of the Hebrew, like getting on Blue Letter Bible and having a little bit more of a grasp of what the Hebrew is saying, or the Aramaic or whatever, it should give you kind of a little jumping off point for that. So that's what I'm doing. And this is really to make sure I do my study thoroughly. I translate the whole Bible. And so I figure if I have to do this to make sure I'm looking at every word of the Hebrew in context, well, then might as well write it down. And so my first one's just going to be the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. My second one is going to be the prophets of Israel. And this is mostly lined up with the prophets. The only ones that I'm taking out of it, actually, I think the only one I'm taking out of it is Ezekiel, and then the post-exilic prophets. So Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, because they're all part of Judah after the exile. So the prophets of Israel is going to essentially cover from Joshua down to Jeremiah and Lamentations. It's going to close with Lamentations. So what we're going to do here, I haven't done Joshua yet, but I've done a lot of the book of Judges. I break apart the book of Judges into the Judaic portions and the Israel priesthood portions. So you have two sources for the book of Judges. One seems to be Samuel, and one seemed to be the scribes of Jabez. And the scribes of Jabez are a Judaic source, and the stuff that's at the beginning and the end of Judges, which doesn't fit the chronology, that comes from this Jewish source. So I'm going to put that stuff with Ruth, and then I'm going to take the stuff that was probably all written by Samuel, which starts with Joshua dying and then Othniel, and it goes to Samson. Because Samson is right around the time, Samson's death is around the time that Eli, who is the priest Samuel's serving, is the judge. So Samson goes right into that period. And so then I go from there, and I'm going to go to, I'm going to do the books of the Kings, but I'm going to try to break them up. So like I break these stories up because they're clearly different narratives that were pulled in together for one big book. And then when I get to Samuel, I'm going to say, here's where Samuel ceases, and here's where Gad the seer starts. And I'm going to try to break those apart to the best of my ability, because it doesn't seem like they're altering the contents of the books. It just seems like they're overlapping them chronologically as best as they can. So there, you seem to be able to extrapolate where Samuel's book ends and where Gad the Seer's book begins, and then where Gad the Seer's book ends, and there's overlap between that and Nathan, and where that begins. So I'm going to do my best to try to break those up, because it tells you right in Chronicles that those are the source material, and then Chronicles just takes that same source material and writes Chronicles, which has some different details from the official royal records and omits some things. So it's mostly about Judah. Okay. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to insert with here, just like I did with the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul. Here's where you read Isaiah, or this part of Isaiah. Here's where you read this part of Jeremiah. Here's where you read Habakkuk. Here's where you read Zephaniah. So that just like with my Apostles' Teaching book, you have something like that is, you could kind of call it like a textual critical edition, but it's more like if you're reading the Bible from the perspective of a history versus a canon, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to alter what the Bible says, but I am going to break it up into sections and then put those sections named after who I believe wrote that section. And I think we have most of that information right in the Bible. So it's literally like Iddo the seer, Jehu the prophet, Nathan, Abijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. It's like half a dozen prophets that write almost the whole thing. And Jeremiah seems to be its final editor. And that's why we have almost nothing on Manasseh, because Isaiah is killed during Manasseh, and the next major prophet is Jeremiah. And Manasseh has a bunch of stuff that's in Chronicles, but it's not from a prophetic source, so it's not in Kings. Okay? So anyways, this is going to contain, again, pretty much Joshua down to Jeremiah. So it's going to, it is essentially what the Hebrews called the prophets, but it's not going to contain all the books that were in the prophets. And then the rest are going to be, and it's essentially what the New Testament calls the writings, but I'm going to call it the Chronicle of Judah. And the reason is because maybe I will change it to the writings. We'll see. But it's going to essentially start with Job, because Job came in through the Judahites. It mentions Elihu, who is a relative of Ram, who is the grandson of Judah, I think. And then after that, we have in the Book of Chronicles all kinds of stuff in the history of the Chronicles that takes place while the Jews are before they're slaves in Egypt. And then it jumps forward to, it's going to have those portions of, and I didn't put that in the table of contents, but the decline of Judah is going to be the portions of Judges that the Judahites add, and then Ruth. And then that's going to take you right forward to the Chronicle, because the Chronicle, even though it contains all this stuff from Genesis, it really jumps forward. It contains stuff from Genesis and stuff from this Egyptian period. It really jumps forward to the time of Saul and David. So from these, you're going to have essentially the same history, but from a Jewish, or from a Judaic perspective instead of an Israel perspective. And then from there, we're going to have the writings. The Psalms of Judah is the Psalms, obviously. The Proverbs of Solomon is obviously Proverbs. The Preacher is Ecclesiastes. Song of Songs is Song of Songs. And then the prophets I have are going to be Ezekiel, who is a priest who is taken in captivity. Daniel is a prince who's taken into captivity, but he's a prophet. I'm going to break up Ezra into the book of Zerubbabel, which is the first part of Ezra. And then between that, I'm going to have Zechariah and Haggai, because they're mentioned halfway through the book. And then Esther, because she's during Ahasuerus. And then the book of Ezra goes down to the days of Artaxerxes. So what I'm really doing is I'm breaking Ezra in half, and I'm taking Esther and these two prophets and putting them in between, and then picking up in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then Malachi at the end of that. So I haven't figured out, because the Proverbs or the Psalms is very long. And I don't know if I almost want to take the Psalms and make that another book. like just the Psalms, because it's 150 Psalms. If you're writing these Psalms in like a poetic style, it's a huge page count. And I think this book would exceed probably 600 pages if I did this. If I took out the Psalms, it'd be probably around 300 pages. And then the Psalms would be its own book that's like 200 pages. And I may do that just to have the work of translating each and every Psalm for myself, because there's a lot of theological material in there that I need to incorporate in House of God, and so I do need to do that. So I might just do that as a second book. So I might just have it kind of like the Law of Moses, or the books of Moses, the Prophets of Israel, the Chronicle of Judah, and then the hymnal of Judah, which is the Psalms. Okay, I might do that. But anyways, that's what I plan on doing, and so. What I'm really doing is something similar to my apostles' teaching, but with the whole Old Testament. And I'm not going to go back to probably doing 2 videos a week. I'm probably just going to keep doing 1 a week. But what I will be doing in my teaching is this. I'm going to continue through the New Testament, and I believe we'll be close to being on the book of Revelations by the turn of next year. Like, it might be January or February. By the time we get to it, by that time we should be on the book of Revelation. So if you're going to stick with me till that time, we're going to be on the New Testament, the apostles' teaching throughout the end of the year. What I'm working on between now and the end of the year is just kind of a touch up, not really a rewrite. There's probably going to be some additions, but to my Revelation book. And so my Revelation book, which seems to be my most popular books of all the books I've written, which is good because we're getting close. I'm just going to be adding like a table of contents I'm going to be doing this to all my books eventually, but a table of contents that is more like my Servant by the Way book. Don't have that open. Where I just learned some things on Microsoft Word about how you can break things up into like a preface introduction where you have like Roman numerals and then start with page 1 on chapter 1. And then also subheadings, which is something that just looks better, but especially if you're accessing the book for like just a lookup of something, then it takes you to sections on it. And I just think that's better. I think the original book I kind of wrote more like a story versus I guess like a reference material, which it is more of a reference material because it just goes line by line through the book. And so what we're going to start doing probably in January is covering the book of Revelation with contents, not necessarily covering the Revelation book, but contents from the Revelation book. And then any of you who want to, again, $10 sub on Patreon, you can get that for free if you're subbed. And then what I'm going to do is probably be updating this book. I already moved all the footnotes to the end as endnotes just because it makes for a cleaner read. And most people aren't necessarily looking for the footnotes. It's that way for those people who want those notes. That's something I did after I went to seminary. For those people who want those notes, you just put a bookmark in the end and they're all in order. So what I'm going to be doing is just kind of touching that up with some additions I've learned in prophecies related to like Isaiah and Zechariah, things that I understand more clearly now than I did when I wrote the book. So not anything major. And then I'm probably going to rewrite my appendix, which is just this. These are suggestions that other people have given me, but with these kinds of prophecy and kinds of fulfillment, giving more examples and a more thorough exposition of those examples. I think with the page count, and it is my thinnest book, I think there's room for me to add like another 10 pages of stuff and just say, here's a more thorough exposition on the hermeneutics of prophecy with more clear examples. So that's it. For the most part, it will stay the same. There might be a couple of little details there. I am watching the whole Neom thing because I did focus on Neom as a what I believe to be a strong candidate for the Mystery Babylon that's just destroyed and falls into the sea. which the part of Neom, which is the octagon, is being built on the sea right now. Neom has canceled most of its projects because of the war, obviously. People say they're canceling them because it's not economically viable, and I don't think it was ever economically viable. I think it's like a Tower of Babel pipe dream, but that doesn't mean they're not going to do it. They have war going on. They have attacks going on from the Houthis and the Iranians now, which would raise their insurance costs on everybody who's working over there, and also ensure that pretty much nobody's going to come as they're building this stuff to actually live there or tour there. So it makes sense that they're stalling it because this war's on. And what I predict in my Revelation book is that most of that building and construction is going to be going on after World War III, leading up to its destruction. So that was my theory, because again, after World War III, they're going to want some big economic building boom going on somewhere that everybody can get all hyped up about, to kind of turn them away from the fact that we're now under a world government, and who done it and who was responsible for World War III. I think that's the plan. So you're going to have probably some scapegoating of Christians in the early phase, and then that's going to kind of die off as people get into this building thing more and more. So it can draw all the moneyed interests of Europe and Eurasia and in Africa towards Neom. That's what I believe is going to happen, while Israel is kind of building up its religious stake in the build up to the Antichrist taking over. So I might touch up some things on that based on things I've learned headlines wise and just following geopolitics wise. But it's going to be essentially the same book. And so what I am going to do is, starting in January, I'm going to advise that as we go through the book of Revelation, those of you who haven't, just get on Patreon and get a $10 digital copy if you want, or get the book by that time. But I should have this re-update by the end of the year. And then also what I'm going to be working on next year is slide decks. So I am definitely not putting Serpent by the Way up for $10. It was a ton of research, took a huge toll on my body and my finances to write this thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this up just for hard copies for probably at least a year. Over the next year, I'm going to try to reread and touch up Rightly Dividing, and then maybe I'll put that up on Patreon within a year and a half from now. Hopefully within a year from now, but I've just got a lot going on, so I don't know if I'll be able to do it that quickly. And then Serpent by the Way, probably within 2 years from now. I'm going to try to have all this stuff up live by 2029, everything for free, because I believe we're going to get shut out of the internet by then. So what I'm going to do by that time is I'm going to be working on slide decks. Like I have one just on theology. That's going to go from Greek philosophy and all the stuff that's going to be taken. And I'm going to try to build these into kind of attractive but informative slide decks that I'm going to be putting up on Patreon for free to any even free subscribers. And then Serpent by the Way is going to be one that's, again, going to cover the ancient history and the ancient paganism and all that stuff. So this is kind of your Old Testament apologetics plus history of paganism down to the corruption of Jerusalem. And if you remember, I was covering all these stuffs like the Book of Jubilees, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs and what's wrong with them. And all those slide decks are going to be on Patreon. And so my goal God's kind of put it on my heart. This is just where I've landed based on a dream. I'll just be honest about it. That I'm going to be here in Arizona until nukes fly, and then I'm going to go back to Michigan. I don't think I'm going to move to Israel. I've looked into that a couple of times, and both times praying on it, I felt like God was moving me away from that desire. The first time was I was going to move out there to go to Hebrew University, and my references weren't coming through, and I wasn't getting my calls returned. And then I just set it aside because I thought maybe God's just not blessing it because he doesn't want me to do that. And then October 7th happened. So definitely would have been in Israel when October 7th happened. I had the trip planned and everything. And then after I finished this last book, I thought all I've got left to write is House of God, and then Millennium Underground, which I figured I would spend some time traveling through the U.S. towards Israel and maybe be there by 2029. And I felt like the Lord gave me, I was praying on it and asking the Lord, where should I go? What should I do next? And within probably a week of that, I had a dream. I'll just be honest, this is going to seem weird to you. Some of you it won't. I had a dream where I was literally standing in Russia, where Vladimir Putin had made a red line with the U.S. and basically said, essentially, if you encroach on China, we'll nuke you. This is what Russia says. And what we were doing is we were building up all around China as if we were going to attack China. And what we were doing is, like, Putin made this red line, and so we were just inching as close to the line as we possibly could. And while we were still back from the line, but just inching up to it as close as we could, literally Putin just pushes a red button, and he says, "Now what are you going to do?" Like, he gave us a red line. We were encroaching to it. And before we got to it, he just pushed the red button and said, "Now what are you going to do?" And in the dream, I was literally, Putin was there, and I was surrounded by underground missile silos. And these massive, I mean, it was thundering. Like, it was so loud. It was so terrifying. And all I was doing in the dream was, like, on my knees praying in tongues, because I was literally, like, in awe of how much power and destruction just got unleashed. And I'm sitting here on my knees praying, and this has only happened to me maybe a handful of times in my entire Christian walk, where I have a dream and something happens, and in the dream I'm usually confronted with a person who's got a demon or some historical thing that's happening that seems to be like World War III or epic like that. And I just, in the dream, start praying in tongues and start, like, it's almost like my flesh doesn't know what to do, but my spirit does. And so my spirit is just praying to God. And I'm literally sitting around like half a dozen missile silos as these missiles are shooting up in the air, and big, massive plumes of fire, and they're like purple for whatever reason. I just remember that. And it's the loudest, most terrifying thing I can imagine experiencing in this dream. And I realized, like, America is going to be just devastated. And I'm just, like, not knowing what to do. And then in the dream, immediately all the phones go dead. And so there's people around me, and everybody around me is like, their phones aren't working. The internet is gone. Like, what happened? I don't know. And in the dream, I say to the people around me, I said, "Follow me, I'm going back to Michigan." And I've had similar dreams like this in the past, where I'm in Michigan, and this is literally dreams that are like 10 to 15 years old, where I'm working in a factory making parts for drones. And all these people start coming to me, and this was before I got into YouTubing. And there's much more I could talk about these dreams. I've only shared these with a few people. And it's not like I have them all the time. I'm not trying to be the next Troy Black. It's like, let's say half a dozen dreams I've had over my 26 years of being a Christian, but things like this. And most of the big ones where I wake up going, I think that was prophetic, most of them are about World War III. A few are about, either someone having a demon or something that's going on in a church, a few, but most of them are about World War III. And again, we were talking about like half a dozen to a dozen dreams over 26 years of being a Christian. So point is that kind of confirmed to me that I am going to be in the U.S. until parts of America get nuked. And I think I'm going back to Michigan after that. I think that's what God is telling me I'm going to do, which means I'm going to be here for a few years. And that internet blackout, which I believe is coming, it's going to be between World War III and the rise of the one world government. I believe there's going to be an internet blackout. I believe it's going to totally destroy the world's economy and make everybody completely dependent on the New World Order when it rises up again. And it's going to be put out as like we had to do this because of terrorism, nuclear war, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be some official reason why they had to shut down the internet. And now only people who are getting online with the New World Order government are allowed to get back on the internet. That's what I think it's going to be. And then a few years later, the mark of the beast. That's what I think it's going to be. So I realize that gets me pretty close to date setting, but I'm just looking at what I'm praying and what I believe God is showing me for what I'm supposed to do, not for what anyone else is supposed to do. And I still think 2033 is going to be significant. Does that mean Jesus is going to come back 2033? I don't know. I just think it's going to be significant. And I'm not trying to say, thus saith the Lord. I'm just trying to share experiences which lead me into what I'm doing. So what I'm trying to do now that God's kind of, I feel like, given me clear 3 years, and I've talked to my pastor about this, is stay involved in my church, see if there's anything I can help out with there. And then in the meantime, put as much information up online that people can download and keep. And that by 2029 will be hopefully all of my books that are available, and all of my slide decks that I make that are for teaching, which are going to take you through church history, ancient history, the occult, the Bible, and eschatology. That's my plan. Okay. So, you guys don't see what I'm doing behind the scenes, those of you who support me. I just want to say, for those of you who have supported me financially, I am incredibly grateful. I don't say it enough. I wasn't raised with a lot of praise, and I'm not inclined to give praise when I should. I hate flattery, and I hate commercialism, and I hate brand building. So I'm kind of inclined to be as far from that as I can. But then I kind of err on the other side of not saying thank you enough. Like, I don't believe anyone's donating money to me to hear their name read off at the end of a video. But I don't ever want to do super chats. I don't ever want to do something where I'm going live asking you guys for money, or, trying to do that on a regular basis. I don't want to get into commercials. I don't want to get into ads. Even when I tried like a little merch for a little bit, it's like I probably spent more money than I made. And honestly, that's not something that I really want to do. It's just I learned how to use some tools, and I thought I'd be creative and wanted to make some t-shirts for myself. And I got to tell you, most of those t-shirts I have now and I've had for 6 months to a year don't feel great when I wear them. So I don't care to make money that way. It's just something I just thought I'd try. The only things I want, I'd give the books away for free if I didn't need money to live on. I don't need a lot of money to live on, and I've tried to make my life in that way on purpose. And so for those of you who have donated money for me for trips, for when I was struggling with a mold sickness last year and I wasn't making any income after I just bought a house, and people who've supported me on Patreon, I just want to say huge, huge, huge thank you. That money helps me to not feel anxiety, because it's like I have some savings, I have some retirement. If the Lord tarries 30 years from now, I don't have money to retire. I'm going to find myself working in a factory or a Walmart or something like that in my old age. That's going to suck. But I'm making a bet on the fact that the Lord's going to be back sooner rather than later, and I'm making a bet that the gifts He has given me are most useful if I stop doing other things to make money and just focus on the reading, writing, and research full time. And that's what I do. This is a full-time job for me. I do have days where my brain needs a break, and I might watch movies or play video games or just go to the gym or just do something light. But I really am cranking probably 40 to 60 hours a week doing this stuff. And a lot of it is just because, honestly, I'm a single guy and there's just not a lot of things to do, especially when it's 115 degrees outside. But most of my life revolves around going to church, taking care of my body with gym and hiking and stuff like that, and then doing this work. And every now and then I take a break. But I've been not trying to date for almost a year and a half now, like just not even trying. I don't spend a lot of money. I don't go out to eat a lot, and I just sell books and I drop YouTube videos, and I try to faithfully drop one a week as much as I can. Um, and then improve the content, improve the quality of what I'm doing. I'm never going to be that guy who creates these YouTube videos that are so crisp and the graphics are so great and all that stuff that these videos are going to blow up. It's never going to happen. This is more me using the free sides of YouTube to exploit it for deep research and study with all my flaws, and then put this stuff in front of you guys. And hopefully those of you who are inclined towards teaching yourself, maybe having a home Bible study, will say, hey, you know, when I started doing this stuff, it doesn't take much to hook up a computer or laptop to your TV in your living room and just have some slides available with an open Bible where you can just have a handful of people over and say, okay, let's study this. And maybe you've got my book, maybe you've just got your Bible, but maybe the slide decks are helpful. And I started putting stuff like this together like a decade ago when I was teaching my Revelation book in a church before I had the book. But I want to put these up there in crisp formats for you guys. And I do have a lot of them, but I have gotten rid of a lot of them that were just junk or old or redundant. And I'm trying to get these. So I've got apologetics, eschatology, logic versus rhetoric, which I think is more valuable than most other people do. Systematic theology, one in the book of Genesis, one in the Godhead, the apostles' teaching, the new covenant, the Old Testament covenants, and then the prophets. So I want to take these slide decks and keep building them out until they are spectacular. And then you guys can do your own teachings. And then, you know, if this is something that is helpful, whoever might be leading the teaching can use these tools as well. And so I want to give as much of that away for free as I can. You can take these decks and just use them on Google. You don't need to buy a Microsoft subscription for that. But again, a lot of these are stuff that I've clipped together and used a few slides for a presentation here and there, or put them on videos, but did not really try to make it for a finished product that I'm going to, you know, have people upload and download. So I'm going to do that over this next couple of years, hopefully in coordination with what I'm teaching online, so that people can use those tools, so that I can teach a little bit more clearly on these videos and people can use those tools. And my hope is to finish going through the New Testament, probably go through the Old Testament again with the names of God and more knowledge of the Hebrew as I'm learning that. Probably go through church history again, and probably go through the ancient history with my sermon by the way again. I think all of that there would definitely take me about 3 years to do. And that takes us into 2029, 2027, possibly 2030. But the point is I'm going to do as much as I can before 2029, 2030, because I have a feeling by that time it's going to be nuclear. That's just, I don't have a thus saith the Lord. God hasn't shown me this. I know it's heading in that direction. I believe God showed me that. But I want to get as much of that out there into you guys' hands to take offline in case we get shut off the internet. That's the goal. So anyways, I want to say thank you again for those who have listened. Those of you who've been buying the books, especially those who've been buying them and sharing them, thank you. It keeps me going. It keeps me afloat. It keeps me encouraged. And it keeps me not anxious about how I pay my bills. I think we're heading into some real hard times financially. And I do it a lot less than I did a year ago or 2 years ago, but walking away from, you know, a business where I probably still could be making easily $200,000 a year plus, seemed like in the flesh a really dumb move. In faith, it seems like the right move. It seems like what God's blessed me to do. But it has been a test of my faith, and spiritual warfare is a real thing. Satan, boy, I dropped this book Sunday, and I got to tell you, probably in the past week or two before I dropped this book, I was being attacked by Satan so hard. I was being pushed towards going, this book's just speculative, conspiracy theory garbage. Nobody's going to read it. You're going to look like a fool. Don't even publish it. And delete Rightly Dividing. Like, those attacks and feelings were intensely coming upon me, to the point that when I sat down with my pastor to, I gave him my book and I wanted him to give me his thoughts in the last chapter, in the last section, some critical feedback before I wrote my final draft and published it. In the time leading up for that, I just started having these really depressing, anxious feelings like, this is stupid, this is garbage, this is junk. And even last night, I just put this thing live, and I was planning on doing this live meeting today. I mean, I started getting intense demonic attacks. Not something physical, but like something pressing thoughts. I couldn't go to sleep. I could just tell there's something satanic coming at me. And as I prayed on it and I asked God, I'm like, God, I need wisdom. What am I doing? Am I sinning? Am I doing something wrong? Where is this coming from? I woke up with a clear as day. It's because you're putting this book out. It's because you're putting out a book that is explaining exactly what Satan's doing, what he has been doing, and what he's doing now. And it's not crazy conspiratorial stuff. It's mostly stuff that most academics would be like, yep, that makes sense. It's a handful of things that conventions would be like, well, we don't believe that. But I would say, well, let me ask you some questions, and they would probably duck me. So it really is just, it's challenging Egyptian chronologies, Sumerian chronologies, the LXX. It's challenging carbon dating, and it's challenging people who are centralizing a dismissal or diminishing of the global flood as a foundation of their thinking, which is what Peter makes the foundation of the thinking of the scoffing that happens in the last days. It says they're going to come scoffing, saying, where's the sign of his coming? And it places that on the foundation of because they're willfully ignorant of the flood. And I think I explain why in this book, and I think I do a pretty good job of it. And I think Satan doesn't want this out there into the hands of Christians. And so, even though I don't expect myself to ever be famous or a huge published, I think I did something with God's blessing and anointing and gifting that Satan doesn't like. And I had the same thing go on when I wrote my Revelation book. I had a neighbor who was a Catholic who was into Taoism. And when I was a neighbor to this guy, the first time I met him, this guy would always help me with yard work and explain yard keeping stuff to me when I owned my first house. He comes over and he starts talking Taoism to me because he's literally a death counselor. He's basically counsels people who die. And this guy is telling me all this stuff, and I realize, like, this is paganism, and I start pushing back on it. But I'm praying as he's talking to me because I feel this heavy demonic presence of what he's talking about. And it's so heavy that his little dog is like going away from him and cowering under my leg. And as this is going on, I'm praying, and then I challenge him, and I don't remember exactly what I say to him, but I said, I think all this is just you avoiding sharing the gospel with these people as they're dying, and that's your responsibility. And this guy, who was my neighbor for about 5-6 years, he looks at me and he goes, maybe you're right. That's what he said. And immediately the demonic presence dissipated. His dog started acting normal and went right back to him. And this guy, over the 5 years that I lived next to him, he had some severe problems with his temper. And his marriage seemed like it fell apart. Like he moved out. He got into some work. The work was taking him to a bad mental place. He was making good money, but not doing well with his marriage. He started yelling at his wife and kids. He snapped at some people coming over for a Bible study of mine. And there's just some things going on. And I always got along with this guy, but he was going through some stuff spiritually. And I just prayed for him. I talked to him. I always talk to him in a gentle tone because, I didn't see this guy as an evil guy, but I saw him as having some bad ideas in his head that were leading to some destruction in his life. Well, this guy comes up to me as I'm working on this Revelation book in 2018, and he goes, I've just been praying for you a lot because God's just been putting into my heart that there's something very important about this book you're writing. This is my Catholic neighbor who was into Taoism when I met him. Okay? This guy goes from his marriage falling apart, he's not living at home anymore, to coming back, leaving the work he was doing, reconciling with his wife, repairing his marriage. This is all over a 5-year period. And he's sitting here going, there's something very important about this book you're writing, and I'm praying because Satan's against what you're doing. Amazing, amazing testimony. So here's me just trying to do my best work, but I can tell you, as I was writing this book, the spiritual warfare around me was through the roof. I mean, people claiming I was full of Satan, I was demon possessed, I was mentally ill and off my meds, people getting on publicly on Facebook and say, we know that guy, we know he teaches heresy, blah, blah, blah. And none of the stuff that I've talked about, for instance, like feminine typology of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament, I hadn't come anywhere near that yet. I'm just teaching the mid-trib rapture, and the only other doctrine that I'm getting into that's different than what I grew up around was believing you can't lose your salvation. That's it. And the spiritual warfare stirred up around me was so intense, I don't have any of my Christian friends that I had back then. I mean, no, I take that back. I have a few, but they were, none of them from any of the churches I went to. They're Christian friends that I've had throughout the years that have remained my friends, but none of them from the churches that I went to. And by the time I had finished this book and publishing it, I had a guy who I had helped out with a job and a place to live during COVID and all this stuff turn around, and I found this out just this past year and told a bunch of people that he tried to steal a copy of my business, and he told a whole bunch of people that he quit my business because he found a massive amount of porn on my computer, which was just completely false. So, I mean, I could sense demonic stuff going on, but the amount of stuff I experienced from Christian people was so intense. And I mean, the church that started all this stuff was a church that said, we're never going to teach on eschatology here because we don't care. So when my Rightly Dividing book, when I was working on that and I was posting stuff on YouTube, just stuff I was learning as I was reading that, I was having people get mad at me. Where I'm like, I'm not talking about them, but I might be talking about an idea that is carried on in their church. And as I'm critiquing these ideas and showing the evidence, people are getting mad at me. And they're unfriending me on Facebook, and they're even calling me out publicly. Like, do you have any idea how you come across? You act like you just know more than everybody. And I'm like, I'm just reading and researching and sharing the things I'm finding when I'm researching on Facebook posts. I'm not attacking anybody. I'm attacking some ideas, but I'm not attacking anybody. And again, spiritual warfare, spiritual warfare, spiritual warfare. Now I'm doing this book and I'm finishing it. I've got, recently John Brisson was on talking about something that he mentioned me, and people are trying to say Aaron teaches the Gnostic Sophia, divine feminine, blah, blah, blah. And we've had some people going around slandering me about that. I'm like, I'm not teaching that at all. I do teach that there are certainly feminine expressions of the Old Testament of the Holy Spirit, which is wisdom in Proverbs, and that's definitely a she. And yes, the Greek word for wisdom is Sophia, but that's nothing like the Gnostic Sophia, who is like the mother of the Logos or something, or created like by the Logos and is created by Yaldabaoth or whatever, the demiurge, and this weird stuff. Like, I have nothing to do with those things. I'm just showing you what's in the Bible. Now, do they use some of that stuff in their corruption? Sure. Satan's always been starting with Scripture and corrupting it. But what has been following me as I've been writing these things is just slander. It's just, oh, you're starting your own Bible. Yeah, I'm translating the New Testament. You realize when you get on there and you read the 50 different translations that are on Bible Hub, like half of those were written by a guy. It's just a guy. Some of them were written by teams of guys. Some of them were just written by a guy. And they all have variations in things they say and believe in what was in the original, just like I do. I just did my best with it. It's not a Bible that I'm saying, here's the best Bible everyone should be using. It's just my study put on paper. That's that. But what Satan seems to be against, the things that I'm exposing most, what's the common thread in these things is the millennium, the rapture, and honestly, futurist eschatology. That's a common thread in all these books. I think Satan is against that. I think he's against any form. I mean, he's coming against any form of the rapture, but the pre-trib rapture seems to be the one that endures the most because it's the one that is the least biblical. And I think a biblical view of eschatology is what Satan is against, and all my stuff leads towards discernment. This contradicts Christian nationalism and postmillennialism. This warns you about Gnosticism and conspiracy theories. This tells you what's going to happen, and this tells you what was the original apostolic teaching. It gives you the books, and then it gives you a summary of the theology, which includes premillennial rapture eschatology. I think Satan hates that because he is trying to get you to believe something else. And so if somebody is teaching the truth in that regard, he is trying to dissuade them so that ignorance takes over the church. And he's been very successful in that in the 21st century. And the Bible kind of says he would be. So that's a summary of what I'm doing. If you guys want to support me, again, Patreon. If you're on Patreon, like I said, if you sign up as a $10 sub, the only thing that I ask is if you take, I think I have 2 books on there now. If you take both books, support me for 2 months. And I know some people have come on and then come off and done that. I know other people just come on and then they're like, maybe they get sick of something I say, or maybe finances get tight and they stop. And that's okay. I'm trusting God that, I just say, hey, if you want to support me, here's what I'm doing. Here's how you can support me. Other people have asked me about private donations like Venmo or whatever. And I just say, look for my email and email directly if you want to do that. I do try to keep everything on the up and ups with taxation. But what I have learned with Patreon is I have to pay taxes on any money that I get if I'm giving something away in exchange. Anything above that counts as tips. So if you're like a $10 sub to get those books, I have to pay taxes on that, which is fine. But if you go on there and say, well, I'm giving you $20, the other 10 I don't have to pay taxes on. That's considered tips. So I don't make a lot of money that way. I make probably about a third of my needs on Patreon and book sales, and the other 2/3 on Airbnb being my extra rooms, which works as long as I'm single. So that's where I'm at, and I'm not really holding my breath for anything but that. But that's what it is. And hopefully, if you guys are blessed by the materials and by the study and by the videos more than just, something to listen to on YouTube, hopefully, if that is blessing you, you'd consider blessing me back. So that's the idea. It's not to commercialize, not to monetize, but definitely a workman is worthy of his wages, and that you get that fruit unto the Lord, and I also get everything I need to make sure that I'm not hindered in continuing to do it. So I'm going to be going to Israel in a couple weeks. I'm going to probably do Colossians, Philemon, and maybe Titus before that. And I'll try to start doing those tomorrow, and then I'll take a couple weeks off, and I'll be back. And we'll be pretty close to finishing up Paul's and then getting into Peter's stuff and then getting into John's stuff to close out the year. So hopefully in the book of Revelation by the turn of the year to 2027. So, and probably we're going to see a lot of Black Horse of the Apocalypse, Red Horse of the Apocalypse, and World War III stuff expanding next year, unfortunately. So hope you guys are blessed by this, and thank you for listening. And I realize I'm long-winded and not the most organized, but I appreciate you for sticking with me, and have a great rest of your week. Batman out. Peace.
You done messed up, Aaron. Insubordinate and churlish.